Now, debtors' prisons have been making a comeback in recent years, where many families have had people jailed for not being able to pay simple fines and fees. But now, it seems to have gotten worse, because now many states are incarcerating children whose families cannot afford to pay juvenile court fees and fines. Juvenile court fees and fines. Now, this is from a report done by the Juvenile Law Center, and it's covered by Common Dreams. Now, it's called Debtors' Prisons for Kids, the High Cost of Fines and Fees in the Juvenile Justice System. That's a kind of an unsexy title, but it's exactly what's going on. Now, this report documents the results of a survey of 183 people involved in the juvenile justice system, including lawyers, family members, and adults who had been incarcerated as children in the juvenile justice system in 41 states. The report authors discovered that in most states, the amount of fees and fines imposed on children and their families once a child enters the juvenile system tend to add up to where many are unable to pay. But they also found that in many states, statutes establish that youth can be incarcerated or otherwise face a loss of liberty when they fail to pay. Now, for example, in this, and I'll get back to this as well, there was a grandmother who had taken custody of her grandson, but when facing these fees, she was told by a county employee that the only way that she could avoid paying them, that she couldn't afford to pay, was to hand over custody to the state, basically making that child a ward of the state. Wow. So now, what kind of fines and fees are we looking at? Well, many states impose a monthly fee on families whose children are sentenced to probation. When a family can't pay that monthly fee, that counts as a violation of probation. And the child is in most cases incarcerated in a juvenile detention facility. Now, there is a program as well designed to keep kids out of juvenile detention, and it's called a diversion program. Now, this is a community-based program meant to keep them out of detention and help them reintegrate into their communities. However, the cost of this program is completely borne by the families. They have to pay the entire cost, right? If you don't pay the cost, then you end up going right back into juvenile detention. So these programs, probation and the diversion program, are meant to keep you out of jail, but if you can't afford to be parts of to pay those programs, then you go right back into juvenile detention, defeating the whole point of having the program. And it makes it so that these programs and staying out of juvenile detention happens to only be accessible to children whose families are better off financially. Now, not only those, but there are more fees. Families in most states must also pay for the children's court-ordered evaluations and tests, such as mental health evaluations, STD testing, and drug and alcohol assessments. Failure to obtain certain evaluations may result in a failure to be granted bond by the court, which means the child would have to remain in juvenile detention. Or if the tests are performed and the family is unable to pay, well, that counts as a, once again, probation violation, and the child is resentenced, which could mean that that child is being incarcerated, right? Once again. Now, you might be thinking, who cares? They did something wrong, they're criminals, they're violent thugs, right? Or they could be. Well, not necessarily. Some sentences could involve something as simple as truancy. I gotta ask, any of you ever skip class as a kid? That counts as truancy. Look, man, I had a nickname in high school. Every other day. Because that's about when I'd show up. Did I ever get charged with truancy? No. Certainly if I had, maybe I would have ended up in jail under this because I certainly couldn't afford to pay. That's a disaster. And it's a disaster for a lot of children. And look, as I said, they can get you fined and failure to pay. Makes you end up being in prison. Even when fines are not mandated by statute, they may be treated as mandatory in practice. So even if they don't have this on the books, they'll still do it. To illustrate this point, this report describes one impoverished child's experience with a $500 truancy bill in Arkansas. Now they write one individual who had been in the juvenile justice system. They reported that he spent 3 months in a locked facility at the age of 13 because he couldn't afford a truancy fine. He appeared in court without a lawyer or a parent and was never asked about his capacity to pay or given the option of paying a reduced amount. He assumed that he either had to pay the full fine or spend time in jail. He explained, "My mind was set to where I was just like, forget it. I might as well just go ahead and do the time because I ain't got no money, and I know the situation my mom is in. I ain't got no money, so I might as well just go and sit it out." 3 months. 3 months sitting in jail, in a juvenile detention facility. Well, that's 3 months where that kid could have been learning or working or doing something. No. Since they don't have the money, and since he was truant from school, well, they thought, he can't pay, let's just put him back in. Amazing. And of course, that leads to a record, right? Once you're in that system, you end up having a record that you have to apply to get expunged. Now, that record is sealed, right? But it can be requested by future employers. So if this future employer says, requests this, right, and sees that kid spent some time in jail for truancy, well, there goes that job. Likely. Not good, right? It doesn't go away when you become an adult. It doesn't go away at 18. Unless you actually apply to get that. And I'm sure that costs money, right? In fact, there are even more costs on top of that. The report states that almost all states charge parents for the care and support of youth involved with the juvenile justice system. Those include fees for room and board, clothing, and mental and physical health care, among many other charges. An inability to pay can result in youth being deprived of treatment, held in violation of probation, or even facing extended periods of incarceration. Juvenile prisons also charge their own, often higher prices for children's prescription medicines. So they're gouging you even while you're in jail for something that you need. Now, the report says, which frequently results in high charges that poor families cannot afford to pay and interrupts necessary health care for these children. Now, more costs. In the cases where there is a crime that demands some sort of restitution, you do a crime, it hurts someone else, you end up having to pay. Okay, I get that, right? Now, there's a statute in all 50 states that says if a child and their family can't afford restitution charges, the child ends up getting incarcerated. Now look, that doesn't mean I'm against restitution, right? Just because I don't like this doesn't mean I'm against restitution in all circumstances. I think there should be some sort of restitution, obviously. But maybe make it so that the kid does maybe some sort of community service to work off the debt or something similar. I don't know. But what I do know is that if there's restitution and you can't pay it, should you be in prison? I don't agree with that. I don't agree. You should get a chance to be able to work off that debt. And that, of course, presents its own challenges, an exploited labor force. But come on, we got to do something. We got to figure something out, right? Something that's to the benefit of both the person who was aggrieved and the child. Because it doesn't help to have that child sit in juvenile detention. It does nothing useful. In fact, that takes time away from actually being able to learn and being able to work, right? Now, I get to more costs, right? In average, the average cost of a juvenile system involvement is about $2,000 per case. And that's based on Alameda County, California. It's different in other places. And for young people incarcerated for extended periods of time, those costs can add up to be significantly higher. And of course, nobody looks at the effects that kind of debt has on poorer families. But this study did. This looked at that. And they said that the debt, in effect, creates a rift between parents and their children. Recalling that I spoke to a family where a grandmother had taken custody of her grandson, but when facing these insurmountable fears, she was told by a county employee that the only way she could avoid paying was to hand over custody to the state. Given her limited income, she had seriously considered giving up custody of her grandson, which would make him a ward of the state. Now, who's tearing families apart? That's a pretty good example of the debt the high costs associated with this tearing a family apart. As if that kid didn't have enough to go through, right? In some cases, parents themselves can face imprisonment if they fail to pay their children's juvenile system court fees. In a number of states, they write, parents like youth may be found in contempt, either civil or criminal, for failure to pay. Civil! Not just criminal, civil. In civil cases, if they can't pay those debts. The parents could go to prison. Jesus. Parents may also face, they write, increased financial liability through collection fees and interest accruing on payments, as well as civil judgments for failure to pay. The report authors add, when parents face incarceration or mounting debt for failure to pay, they have even fewer resources to devote to educating, helping, and supporting their children. You know, to make sure that maybe they don't do that again, that they don't get in trouble again with the law. Not to mention, look, these parents, I'm certain a lot of them have jobs, very low-paying jobs could be. I mean, we haven't had a minimum wage increase in what? Since the Bush years, and it wasn't very much. Look, these parents often work. Well, if they're in jail because they can't afford these fees, well, what does that do? That makes them even more unable to pay. And then they rack up their own debts. This is a cycle, man. This is a spiral that leads to poor families being put in jail for the mistakes of their children simply for being poor. Okay? And look, kids make mistakes. Kids will be kids. They'll do terrible things. They'll do things that are bad, right? And it's up to you. And no matter how well you parent, sometimes the kids are still going to get in trouble, okay? And this isn't just, you know, bad parenting. You can't blame it all on bad parenting. There are certain things that happen, okay? But look, there is a bright side here. With all this, there's a bright side. The report authors observed that incarcerating children for their family's inability to pay may be actually unconstitutional, which is what debtors' prisons are also supposed to be unconstitutional, but we have them anyway. They said that it is worth noting that the United States Supreme Court has made it clear that an individual may not be incarcerated for non-payment if the court does not first conduct an indigence determination and establish that failure to pay was willful. The Supreme Court has also held that courts must consider alternative measures of punishment other than imprisonment for indigent defendants. Nonetheless, some states require neither willfulness nor capacity to pay in statute, and only in a few explicitly limit or prohibit incarceration for failure to pay. So, despite the Supreme Court saying, hey, you shouldn't be able to do this, there are states that are still obviously doing this, even though they know they're not supposed to. Now, additionally, the Supreme Court has held that courts must provide meaningful notice and, in appropriate cases, counsel when enforcing fines or fees. Now, that didn't happen to the person that was mentioned earlier in the story. That 13-year-old who had no counsel, didn't even have his parents there. So, look, a lot of these states are doing something that is unconstitutional in bringing back these modern-day debtors' prisons and expanding them to children. Now, they also continue, the Supreme Court. This right is even more important for children who lack both the developmental capacity and the legal knowledge to be able to represent themselves. Moreover, the report continues, while further research is needed, existing studies suggest that court cost fines have limited, if any, fiscal benefit to states and counties, given the difficulty in collecting them from families in poverty and the high administrative costs to do so. So if you're going after a family for a $100 fine, you're going to spend a lot more in administrative costs trying to chase down those people to get that fine, right? And then putting them in jail also costs more money than it gets in. It's not sustainable. It's a punitive system, which I think is overly punitive, and it's sort of the wrong way to go. Now, I'm not saying let them go in all circumstances. I'm just saying you've got to work things out. And we're doing it wrong. We're doing it wrong. Now, the Juvenile Law Center suggests that instead of incarcerating children for their parents' failure to pay, that they should seek out and establish more sustainable and effective models for funding court systems rather than imposing costs on youth and families who simply can't afford to pay. Now, look, we talk about the school to prison pipeline, right? I've talked about it, and you know, a lot of different outlets have spoken about this issue and how much of a disaster it is for these families, right? Now, who does this who does this impact for the most part? Poorer families. Poorer families also happen to be minorities, right? A lot of these people might not have stable homes, a good education, or in some cases, food, right? They're not going to do as well in life. And sometimes when people aren't doing well, when they're desperate, they tend to act out. And sometimes in acting out, they do bad things and they end up going to, breaking the law. They end up doing something wrong. And they end up in these juvenile detention centers, right? Now, the double whammy on that is that the family now can't afford to pay that, essentially setting them up for failure for the rest of their lives by continually reintroducing them into a system of incarceration. We're doing this wrong. And of course, a lot of the core reason for this, not necessarily bad parenting, yes, it can be a factor, but I think the big thing here is poverty. Poverty. And allowing people to live in this kind of poverty when we're in the richest nation in the world is a crime in itself. Exploiting them and jailing them for being poor is an even bigger crime. When are we going to learn that putting people in prison and punishing them for being poor doesn't work? It's an absolute disgrace that now we're throwing kids in jail simply for the fact that they're not able to pay a fine. Yes, they did something wrong in the first place, right? But them staying in jail and because they're too poor, their families are too poor, they don't have the economic means, is disgraceful. We've got to put a stop to this system. I thought we got rid of debtors' prisons years ago, decades ago. Now they're back, and they're more insidious than ever. We are better than this. We've got to do better. Hey everybody, if you like this video, then please like this video and share. And if you want to see more like this, then please hit that subscribe button below.